Let's launch into another week of our 4.5 year verse by verse journey through all of God's inspired word by reminding ourselves of the turmoil of the transition from King Herod the Great's kingdom into its next phase. When King Herod was at the peak of his power, he was the third most powerful person in the Roman Empire and a very wealthy and influential man. He was turning the Jewish homelands into the showplace of the entire empire. Had great games, great venues and contests that people would come to from around the world. But when he dies as a paranoid, angry old man. And that's exactly how we see him in the pages of Scripture when he dies at 70. And that happens in March of 4 BC. Now, his heir apparent at that time was a 17-year-old son named Archelaus. And so Archelaus puts on a grand funeral for his father, but ends up causing the deaths of a lot of Jewish people who were protesting events from the last few weeks of Herod's life. And it was in that state of chaos that he and some of his other brothers head off to Rome to let the executor of the will affirm or modify what Herod wanted done. And so when the smoke all clears, Archelaus is designated as the ethnarch of the Jews, which is a notch below king. But he's promised by the emperor that if he behaves himself well, he will be granted the title king. Now, he'll never get that because he's a horrible administrator. But he is challenged by his half-brother Antipas for the title of ethnarch. But Antipas doesn't win out, and he ends up getting exactly what his father wanted him to have, which was the tetrarchy of Galilee and Perea. Another half-brother, Philip, gets a big chunk of territory that surrounds the eastern side of the Sea of Galilee. Now, what is not widely talked about, though, is that there were others that went to Rome to petition that no Herod should be designated king of anything or ethnarch of anything or tetrarch of anything, that instead it would be better for the Jewish people that the Jewish nation's lands just become part of the province of Syria and govern themselves as little bitty Jewish pockets of control, an aristocracy, if you will, with the Sanhedrin and the high priest being the head of the government. Now, that is not the way it plays out, but I wanted you to know that that was a thought. Now, while all this is going on in Rome, there is turmoil back in Judea, where different individuals keep saying, no, I'm the king of the Jews. No, I'm the king of the Jews. And we've got a bunch of infighting that's occurring. One of the individuals that I want you to be aware of is a man by the name of Judas of Galilee. Now, he is the son of Ezekias, the gang leader in Galilee that had been killed by Herod way back 50 plus years earlier because he was a gang leader causing all sorts of trouble up there. And if you remember correctly, that was the beginning of a lot of tensions between the younger Herod and many of the Pharisees of the Jewish people, because they didn't think he should have killed Ezekias without running it past the Sanhedrin first. So now here's his son. And while the kingdom is being arbitrated in Rome, this Judas goes to the capital city of Galilee, a place called Sepphoris, which is only about 4 miles north of Nazareth. And he breaks into the palace and takes weapons there and basically starts promoting himself as the true leader of the Jewish people. Now, once the kings or the tetrarchs and the ethnarchs get back in the country, a lot of these little independence movements just kind of fizzled out, or at least went underground. And that is definitely the case for Judas. All right, so we know that Jesus was growing up in Nazareth because his adopted dad, Joseph, did not feel life in Judea under Archelaus was a safe choice. And in the word of the Lord comes to him through an angel saying, just go to Nazareth and raise him there. And so we can picture Jesus doing exactly what it says in Luke 2:29. And that is that when they'd performed everything according to the law of the Lord, they returned into Galilee to their own town of Nazareth. And the child grew and became strong, filled with wisdom, and the favor of God was upon him. So Jesus is growing up physically. He's growing up mentally and emotionally and spiritually even. And this is one of those things we have a hard time wrapping our minds around. It's a function of what's described in Philippians chapter 2, where it says that even though Jesus was in fact God, he didn't consider that equality with God as something he needed to cling to, but instead he emptied himself or divested himself of his supernatural powers and prerogatives, and he took on the form of a human being and just lived life as all of us live. Because as the book of Hebrews says, he was tempted or tested in all ways like unto ourselves, except he didn't sin. So he had to learn to walk and talk and be potty trained, and he had to go to school and learn his letters and his numbers and how to do chores around the house, all of those things. Now, he's also got some brothers and sisters growing up under him. It's not at all surprising that there would probably be a new child every year or so, or a couple of years or so, coming up under him. And so we know that he has 4 named brothers in scriptures. There's Joseph Jr., there's Judas, the guy that wrote the book Jude, and we've got Simon, and also we've got Jacob, or James as we know him, because he's the one that wrote the New Testament book of James. And then Jesus had at least 2 or more sisters, all growing up. So we've got quite the little household growing up under Mary and Joseph in Galilee, in Nazareth. And Jesus is learning the trade of his father, which is working with wood, working in construction. He's a carpenter. And there would have been plenty of work for him in the big city of Sepphoris. Like I said, only about an hour's walk away. And so I firmly expect that they would have commuted back and forth to that big city throughout those training years of Jesus as he's learning his father's trade. Now, in the year 6 AD, something big happened that changes the government dynamic in Judea. And that is this. Enough complaints had accumulated over the past 9 or so years against Archelaus's mismanagement that Caesar Augustus demands that he come back to Rome and make a defense for himself. And so this is when Archelaus is 28 years of age, and so he gets on the ship and makes his way to Rome, where he is found guilty of mismanagement, and he is stripped of his ethnarchy and his wealth, and he's basically banished to the frontier of the Roman Empire, to a town that we know today as Vienna. And it was not a quaint European village at that time. It was on the edge of a war zone, and so not a nice place to be banished to. And so because there had been this request earlier that by the Jewish people, many of the prominent Jewish leadership, that the Judean kingdom just simply be folded into Syria and then be governed locally by a Roman procurator or prefect and the Sanhedrin and the high priest. That's exactly what Caesar Augustus does in 6 AD. So he sends a new legate or a new president of Syria to Antioch, a man by the name of Quirinius, and along with him a procurator named, it's Capanius, I believe is the name. And the first order of business is that they have to account for all of the finances of the Judean and Samarian and Idumean ethnarchy of Archelaus. And part of the way that you would do that is you would have everybody come in and register again, like they did, when Jesus was born. They have to give an accounting of what their expected income is, and their name and their city of birth, and probably even their city of employment, things of that nature. So there's a whole nother census that happens in AD 6. And that's why Luke says of the census that Jesus was born during, this birth census is the one previous to that made when Quirinius was the governor of Syria. So that's the Bible tie-in. Now here is the big future tie-in. You remember Judas of Galilee, the guy that I told you had gone to the palace at Sepphoris and had tried to promote himself as the genuine leader of the Jewish people? Well, he began a protest against this idea that the Jews of Judea should be governed directly by a Roman prefect. He promoted the idea that no one should be governing Jews except for God and God's designated leaders, like the high priest and the Sanhedrin. And so he starts a brief protest movement that kind of fizzles out in the immediate, because the high priest of the time steps up and says, no, this is appropriate. We should be paying taxes to Rome. They had been paying taxes to Rome. They'd just been doing it through a Herodian leader. But there are enough of these people like Judas that don't like the direct taxes that they take on a new name. They are called the Zealots or the Kanani. So they are the tax protesters against direct taxes paid to Rome. And so Judas's sons will later be prominent in the Great Rebellion that takes place in the 60s, and during which the city of Jerusalem will eventually be destroyed. So that's all going on in AD 6. So there was a big kind of blow up momentarily, and then it kind of calmed down again. But afterward, Judea, Samaria, and Idumea, which is just South Judea, are now directly governed by a prefect of Rome. The next year, if we are correct in Jesus being born in 7 BC, then that means that in 7 AD, he would have turned 12 years old in the spring. And the next story that we read about is a Passover visit when Jesus was 12 years old. So that would mean it would take place in the spring of AD 7. So the year after the momentary tax revolt of Judas of Galilee. And that might help you appreciate a little bit more of the tension of mom and dad in this story. So Luke chapter 2, verse 41. Now his parents went to Jerusalem every year at the feast of Passover. Now Joseph is required to go 3 times a year: Passover, Pentecost, and Tabernacles. But some Jewish families went together every one of these feasts. But for sure, we know in the case of Mary and Joseph that they went every year at Passover. And it wouldn't have been just the 3 of them. Certainly there are younger children underneath Jesus, probably at least 3 or 4 or so. Verse 42, when he was 12 years old, they went up according to the custom. And when the feast was ended, as they were returning, the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem. His parents did not know it, but supposing him to be in the group, they went a day's journey. Now, let's talk about how this happened. Jesus is 12 years old, which is kind of that transition time between being a young kid and being a young man. And this can sometimes cause confusion in the family. In the caravans, they would travel not as family units, but rather as little gender units, if you will. So let's imagine all the people coming from Nazareth. Everybody's heading out at the same time, and all the men are kind of walking together and talking about men things, and all the ladies are walking along together, talking about all the lady things, and the younger kids are going to be with the lady group, and the older boys, say 10, 11, 12 maybe, and above, are going to be traveling with the men. Now, Jesus has just turned 12, and so he's in that place where it's very easy to flow back and forth between the 2 groups. I remember this when I was growing up. Family get-togethers, there were always several of the families together, lots of cousins. And when I was younger, I spent a lot of the time around my mom and aunts and grandmothers. But then later, I went out with the guys and, built fences or did things with the animals. But there was a time in between, right around, this 11, 12-year age, that I would flow back and forth between the 2 groups. That's kind of what was happening right here. And so Mary assumes that Jesus is with Joseph, and Joseph assumes that Jesus is with Mary, until they get to the first caravan stop on the way home. More than likely, there were 2 overnights on the way home. And they start looking for him. They're not with the other parent, and then they start looking with other relatives and friends, and he's not with any of them. He's not with any of his friends of his same age. And so now hits the panic. Jesus is not anywhere to be found in the caravan. He has to be back in Jerusalem. But they can't take off because it's dark. So they wait until the next morning, very early. And it says, that then they began to search for him among their relatives and acquaintances, and when they did not find him, they returned to Jerusalem searching for him. So they are now back in Jerusalem at the end of a second day. And they're frantically looking around at all the different places where they think that he might have been, like wherever it is that they were camping out when they were at Jerusalem. Because there would always be so many people jam-packed to Jerusalem during these feasts that there were camps set up all around the city. So they're probably checking everywhere, and they can't find him. And it says, verse 46, after 3 days. Literally, it says, on the third day. So day 1 is the day they left to head back and in the evening missed him. Day 2 is the day they traveled back and couldn't find him. And so day 3 is the next day. So Jesus has basically been missing for a little over 48 hours. And they found him in the temple. So in the place where everybody gathers to worship. Now, not in the holy place, but rather in the temple generically. And what was he doing? He was sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. Now, think about the temple complex that Herod had built. There's the shrine building at the center. Then there's a little plaza around that where all the worship happens, where the priests are doing all their works, where the Levites are doing all their work. Then there's the women's court in front of that. And then there's the barrier, where only those that are ceremonially clean can come inside of that barrier. Outside that barrier is the gigantic courtyard of the nations, or the court of the Gentiles. And then around that was a great big, long, colonnaded, covered area where people would gather in large groups, often the rabbis, and talk and teach and question. And there would have been many, many different groups going on at the exact same time. I've always tried to encourage people to appreciate that Herod's temple could easily have gotten 200,000 plus people jammed in to it at the exact same time. Now, that's by their standards of comfort, being up close and personal to each other. But that would be a hard place to find a little kid, a little 12-year-old. So they're going around looking and looking and looking. I'm sure they checked with temple security, because temple security is one of their jobs, probably was help with lost and found and lost people. So eventually they find him, and he is talking to the rabbis, not just simply asking them questions, but answering their questions. And verse 47 says, all who heard him were amazed at his understanding and his answers. So he is well advanced in his understanding of God's word at this time in his life. And we would say, not surprising, he's God himself. But remember the Philippians 2 passage. We're not sure exactly how much information he was getting from God at this point, other than what was just necessary in order to do his job. Remember, he's incognito, growing up as a human being and being tempted in every way like unto ourselves, yet without sinning. Now, verse 48 says, when his parents saw him, they were astonished. And his mother said, Son, why have you treated us so? Behold, your father and I have been searching for you in great distress. Now, all of you who are parents, all of us who have been parents, all of us grandparents, we know exactly the emotion that's tied up into that. Just for a few seconds, I've lost track of my son in a big store, and I panicked. This couple have been missing him for 3 days. This is the third day since they last saw him. And they are not happy with how they're feeling. Now, Jesus' answer is very instructive. He said to them, "Why were you looking for me?" So, why were you running around all over the place looking for me? Did you not know that I must be in my Father's house? So Jesus says, why were you looking everywhere else? Didn't you realize this would be the place to look for me? Now, the word house is not actually there. It's in the things of my Father. So in this holy environment is where they should have looked to begin with. So it's a mild chiding that they didn't give him credit for going to the place that made the most sense. The temple is one of the safest places in Jerusalem to be. Lots of security. Plus, it's the place where people talk about God. And what would he want to talk about while he's waiting for mom and dad to figure out that he's missing and come back and get him? And so, great response. Verse 50, they didn't understand the saying that he spoke to them. And he went down with them and came to Nazareth and was submissive to them. So after everything's done, after this big panic, everybody goes back to Nazareth, and Jesus continues growing up. And he submits to mom and dad, because that's what humans are supposed to do at this age. And his mother treasured up all these things in her heart. So she's storing all this away. And as I've told you before, I think she's the ultimate source of this information for Luke. Verse 52 is where we'll wrap up. And Jesus increased in wisdom and in stature and in favor with God and man. So Jesus grows into adulthood now during the next decade or so. And everybody really likes him and appreciates his work ethic and his spiritual life. And tomorrow, we'll see what happens next.